the chair in psychology of sustainable development and also the founder of the Consumer Decision and Sustainable Behavior Lab at Geneva. Professor Brosch focuses on how emotions, values, heuristics, and automatic processes influence our decisions, especially when it comes to sustainable behavior. And like Simone, he also uses fMRI scans and related techniques. And today he's going to talk about the impact of direct and vicarious warm glow sustainable actions in everyday life. And we're very happy to have him here. Professor Brosch, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So do you see my slides and hear me all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Nice. So I guess I have to start by disappointing you because I'm not going to talk about the brain, but I'm going to talk about emotions nevertheless. And I'm actually super happy in how nicely this blends into the previous talk and the discussions also that you had. Because as you can see from the title, so I'm going to also talk about warm glow, but this time more from well, not from an economic perspective, but from the perspective of a psychologist of emotions who always ask themselves, well, how can we actually create interventions? Is there any way we can leverage this in a causally guided way? So I'm curious to hear what you think about this. First of all, disclaimer. So the work that I'm going to present, I'm going to free write on the work of Kim Dell and Beatrice Conte, who did this in my lab. So Kim now has moved on to NYU, and Beatrice is finishing up her PhD, busily typing now. Paper was just accepted recently, so afterwards, if you want to have more information, you can just refer you to this publication. So yeah, the idea that most of the work in our lab is circulating around somehow is that emotions play a much bigger role in our life, in our decisions, in our cognitions and judgments than we think. And I recently did a review of the predictors of different types of environmentally relevant behaviors. So you have the list there, climate change risk perceptions, willingness to mitigate, willingness to adapt, willingness to support policies, accepting technologies. And so I just put them all together and look what came out. And emotions emerged consistently as one of the strongest predictors of all those different behaviors. So the emotions that people feel, that people naturally experience toward climate change, for example, or towards technologies, always came out at least in the top 3, but very often was the most important predictor. And I told you before, okay, I'm a fan of emotions, so I was hoping that they would come out somehow importantly. But by this result, I was also quite surprised that it was always really one of the most important predictors. So emotions in all our questions to come towards a more sustainable lifestyle, to still manage to avoid the consequences of the path we are on, I think emotions need to be considered to a much larger extent than they are at the moment. But as I already said before, I mean, a lot of that research that I looked at was correlational. So you ask people to what extent are you afraid of climate change? To what extent would you be willing to change your behavior to mitigate? So this is correlational. The question is, well, is there a way to maybe use the power of emotions to promote more sustainable behavior? And of course, this has been tried before. There's a lot of climate change communications that you are certainly familiar with. This was a very impactful article, The Uninhabitable Earth, that was really a doom and gloom scenario of how awful life is going to be once we hit those 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. There's like a whole subgenre of literature now is this dystopic climate literature. And of course you could think, well, this might make sense because people need to be aware of the threat that is looming. And it seems that because of the way that our brain is set up, people have difficulties of really understanding how bad this is going to be, because climate change is often communicated, well, just that in terms of probabilistic increases in temperatures 20 or 30 years from now, and we just have a hard time translating that into, well, what does it mean for me? It's just that there's a big cognitive gap between them. So maybe getting people a bit scared by translating what this means for them. Maybe that's the right path. But you have other people who say, no, this is exactly not what we should do. Here you can see doomsday scenarios can be as harmful as climate change denial. So why would that be the case? Well, fear could lead to climate action if you go like, okay, I didn't know how bad this is. Now I understand it. Now I'm really scared. Now I want to act. But on the other hand, if you crank it up too much, if you get people too afraid and they think, okay, this is so bad that there is nothing I can do, they will still act mentally to reduce the negative emotion, but not by getting rid of the cause, but by down-regulating the emotions, by saying, well, either, okay, I can't do anything there, this is too big for me, or going one further and saying, well, there's nothing I can do. I don't want to feel bad, so I will start saying that it's not true, which, as you can imagine, is also an efficient way of getting rid of the fear, but it was not the way that we want. So should we go for positive emotions? Should we communicate hope? There are some attempts. There are a few empirical studies that show quite a mixed setup, because some studies, when you talk about hope and when you say, well, yes, there are so many things that we can do, they might increase your willingness to act. Other studies that focus on hope have been shown to increase complacency, because like, okay, well, if things are going better, then I can still book my weekend flight to Barcelona, so I don't have to worry if things are going uphill. So all across the board, if people have tried to use emotions to promote sustainable behavior, very often they have found boomerang effects, that you start with good intentions, but then you create the opposite of what you came there for, basically. And so I think that one of the main points I want to make today is we should not oversimplify the functioning of emotions. We do not have emotion buttons. Like, we should not expect that if we press fear, we get a certain outcome. If we press hope, we get a certain outcome. It's definitely more complicated than that. And very often emotions are still used with an overly simplistic comprehension of how they work. And so what we want to suggest is basically, well, if we want to continue trying to use emotions to promote sustainable behavior, we have to do it on an empirical basis. We have to understand the mechanisms that are involved in the elicitation of emotions. And we also should look at individual differences, because not everybody reacts the same way emotionally. And so I'm going to present you just one study, well, actually two studies, but they're very similar. They circle around this topic of how we can understand individual differences in emotional reactivity in the context of pro-environmental behavior. And we looked at that with an experience sampling approach, which means we did it in the field. So we didn't just hand out questionnaires to our participants and said, well, on average, how environmentally friendly are you? But the participants who agreed to take part in this study, we would send them messages on their smartphone like up to 5 times per day, and would bug them and saying, well, in the last hour, did you show a behavior that had an impact on the environment? Which one was it? Da, 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 da. And we started measuring an individual difference measure of environmental trait affect. So this is a measure that we had developed a few years before, which assesses the disposition to experience positive emotion as a consequence of actions with a positive outcome for the environment. So you could call this a trait warm glow. So this is an individual disposition to feel good when you see something good happening for the environment. And so this is classical psychological questionnaire work, but then we came in with the experience sampling approach. For 10 days, participants would receive this 5 times per day. So did you commit or witness an environmentally relevant behavior within the last hour? If they said yes, we asked them to briefly describe the action. And then we asked them, how do you feel at the moment? Rather good, rather bad. And so a first outcome, as I show you here, is environmental behaviors in the field, actually. So this is not super fancy analysis. This is just a bit the description of what people would report. So you can look at some of those examples, like a good thing happening is I recycled my water bottle. I saw somebody driving a Tesla. Exposed to something negative is I saw Trump saying something. Also, people reported stuff that has nothing to do with the environment. You can see that a large part of what people reported was that they committed positive behaviors. There were half as many committed negative behaviors. They witnessed some positive and negative behaviors. About 60% of what they reported was in any way related to the environment. Okay, so in the first step, we wanted to see to what extent are these behaviors predicted by individuals' trait affects? Because if there is something about this warm glow theory, you would expect that people who say of themselves that they more often feel this warm glow should also more frequently commit pro-environmental behaviors. And this is actually what we found. So here we threw in some other psychological measures that you often use if you try to predict pro-environmental behaviors. So those different types of values, they didn't pull any weight there, but the positive trait effect was actually related to a larger probability of committing pro-environmental behaviors in everyday life. Then in the next step, we looked at people's feeling, how they felt during their everydays as a function of those different categories of pro-environmental behaviors that we observed. And so here in the first line, we have what you could call direct warm glow, because people who just reported that they did something good for the environment, they would feel systematically better. Okay, not super surprising. This is what we call direct warm glow. The next finding we did not necessarily expect, because also the people who saw somebody else doing something good for the environment, they also felt better afterwards. So there's some kind of vicarious warm glow happening. So this was not expected, but was a nice finding, because you could say, okay, this could be a way in which we can more systematically elicit warm glow. Because as you had said before in the discussion, we cannot really kickstart people by forcing them to behave in a pro-environmental manner and then hope that they experience a warm glow. But if we can also induce warm glow by showing them positive behaviors, that's opens up a whole different field of interventions. Then you see committed and witnessed negative behaviors led to decreases in affect, okay? And then we also found those interactions with trait affect, so that both the magnitude of the direct warm glow and the vicarious warm glow were predicted by this individual difference measure of a positive trait affect. So both your reaction to your own pro-environmental behavior and your reaction to other people's pro-environmental behavior was stronger for the people who scored high on this individual difference measure. You might wonder why I keep talking about this individual difference measure so much, but it will become really important for the second study. So I just want to drill it into your brain. So as I said, after we found those results, we were first surprised by the vicarious warm glow, impressed that it interacted with positive trait affect, and we saw the potential for an intervention here, because we wanted to see, well, can we use the reactions to those witnessed pro-environmental actions to promote more pro-environmental behaviors? And this is what we tried to do in the second study, where again, at the very beginning, participants filled in some questionnaires, and then they underwent the same experience sampling design, a bit short, only for 3 days, but we combined it with an intervention in that every morning they would receive some news items on their smartphone, which were either about a positive environmental event, so reading some news about massive international tree planting efforts, news about a negative environmental event, like a huge oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and some control events with no environmental impact, or not a big environmental impact. And so the question was, do the people who see positive environmental news in the morning over the rest of the experiment show more pro-environmental actions? Bad news first. So on average, we did not find any systematic differences between the groups. You can see some indications of differences, but none of this turned out statistically significant. But then we started to look into that trade effect measure that I keep reminding you of here. So first, we showed that this measure substantially predicted our participants' effective reactions to the intervention. So the people who score high on this measure had substantially larger positive effective reactions to the positive environmental news. Whereas you can see on the left side of the scale, there's not much happening. And the positive trade effect also predicted the behavioral reactions to the interventions. So here, I think this is the most important slide I'm gonna show to you today. So let me walk you through this in detail. So here you can see the Johnson-Neyman intervals, where you can see that the slopes are actually statistically significant outside the dotted lines, so just at the extremes of the sample distribution of the positive trade effect. So here on the right, for the participants with very high trade effect, for this very high emotional reactivity, the intervention worked out exactly as we would have hoped for. So the people in this segment who saw positive news about the environment in the morning, over the rest of the day, they would show more pro-environmental behaviors. However, you've seen before that on average, we didn't find any differences. So that can only mean that on the other side of the spectrum, our intervention backfired. So the people with a low effective reactivity, when we gave them the good news in the morning, over the rest of the day, they would show less pro-environmental behavior. So we have exactly this boomerang effect that I mentioned at the beginning, but now we can at least start to explain it a bit. We can start to organize a bit the people, and we can say, okay, this works in a specific subset of people, and we can at least identify them. So this could be a way towards more targeted interventions. Yeah, I told you it's only one story, one study. So I'm going to wrap up, and then I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you and to see what you think about this. So first message, experience sampling is an approach that actually allows you to measure environmental behaviors in the real world. And I think you will have in the next presentation, you will talk more about experience sampling, I see from the title. So that's very nice. I can tell you it's quite challenging to implement. So it was really a pain to get this all right, but it's worth it because you can avoid a lot of problems about memory biases or self-presentation biases, people trying to look good or coherent or whatever, by just bugging them very often during the day. We also think it makes sense to look at this measure of trade effect because it predicted quite a number of things across those experiments. Now, it predicted how often people commit pro-environmental actions in their everyday life. It predicts the extent to which positive affect is experienced after those actions, and it even predicts the extent to which positive environmental messages result in subsequent pro-environmental actions. But also the big warning is that we found that messages that are incompatible with a person's affective concern structure may produce reactants. This is a speculation. We don't know if it was reactants, but it's one potential explanation, and result in this boomerang effect here at the effective level. But yeah, to end on an optimistic note, so with a fairly simple and straightforward design manipulation, it is possible to tailor effective messages that lead to increased pro-environmental behavior due to warm glow in a subset of the population. Okay, so I'm gonna quit here and looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you very much. Oh, there are already a couple of questions coming. I think the first one was Diane. And okay, we'll start with Diane.
I actually didn't have a question. I was just applauding for a very good.
Okay, sorry.
No problem at all.
Thank you so much. The second was Kate.
Thank you.
I have about 1 million questions. It's so fascinating, but I was wondering, particularly along the lines of thinking about taking your results, your intervention results, and trying to scale them, what proportion of a population, do you have a representative idea of how many people have this positive affect trait as compared to not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, our sample was not representative, but not as bad as the usual psychology studies, you know, with only psych undergrads. So I think you could probably reach something like 20 to 30% of the population with it. So quite substantial. And also remember that tail that looked so horrible on the left side of the distribution, that was not so bad. Actually, in the end, those were 2 or 3% of the sample that really opened this tail and, well, if you want, ruined our results. But so I think this is an application, an intervention that you could apply to a substantial chunk of the population.
That's really interesting. Just on that particular point, I'm looking at intention behavior gaps in environmentally significant consumption behaviors. And for lots of environmental significant behaviors anyway, you see that there are about 30% of the people that have in representative samples these kinds of intentions. So it is not everybody, but it's not an unsubstantial group of people. So I think that's fascinating. Thank you.
Ganga?
Yeah, thank you. That was really great. I really enjoyed that. It's a similar question to Kate. I was thinking of whether you know anything about the relationship between your trait measure and other things like political attitudes or beliefs in climate change. Because trait, I mean, unless you do a survey, I imagine it's quite difficult to get trait measures. So if you want to target interventions, you have to go by data which is already available. So I was wondering if you know what determines the trait measure, essentially, or what is correlated with it.
Yes. I mean, you can look at all the funky tables in the publication. When we compared it, we looked at the whole homological network. I mean, it links into environmental attitudes, into values, into political ideology, into environmental knowledge. But it always explains more. So there is something additional to this. So it's really, it's like its original, yeah, it's its own concept, if you want. But so does your question imply any way of inferring it from some socioeconomic or demographic? Yeah, I think it's probably easier to hand out the questions and just ask people, well, where are you situated there? I think it would be a bit, I think at the moment I couldn't tell you how to really diagnose it without going into the questionnaires.
Mm-hmm. I have actually like a similar question. How does it relate to personality traits, and does it is it sort of at the same, should one think of it sort of at the same level as, you know, the big 5 locus of control, or is it, how is it sort of in there?
Yeah, it depends on how you would situate overall trait effect in these networks. I mean, I think it's supposed to be quite stable, given that we just developed it in 2018. We don't know yet really how stable it is in the long run. But conceptually, I would say it's, well, not far below the big 5 or something. I mean, it's more specific. No? If you look at factors like what extroversion or neuroticism, it covers a broader area. Whereas here we really want to look at affective dispositions. So we wanted to make it a bit more specific because we were interested in the link to emotions only.
Andrew?
I'm wondering what drives what the theory is of vicarious warm glow. Do you have a psychological theory in your mind that lets you understand what it is?
That is indeed a very good question. We have not started on elaborating that theory because we did not really expect this effect. We were surprised that it popped up, but yeah, no, I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer to that. I mean, you see somebody else behaving in a good manner, in a good way. So I would say it might be linked to emotions such as awe, that you are just inspired by this good thing happening, by the aesthetics of a laudable act, and that this somehow feeds into this.
I think next one was Charlie.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm interested in transport behaviors, and in particular things like parking reduction or parking pricing or road pricing or congestion pricing, all of which has a big effect on behavior but isn't directly down to individuals. It's down to individuals' public opinion for policies that then governments implement. So I was wondering, do you know of a literature that looks at the use of emotion to change public opinion around policies on transport? Has that been looked into? Do you know if people using positive emotions, say for reallocation of parking spaces to green things, has been used in campaigns? And is emotion an important part there?
I mean, generally in terms of policy acceptance, emotions are highly correlated to acceptance. It's usually it's like negative emotions such as worry about climate change is usually one of the #1 predictors. I don't know any research that really looked at interventions specifically in the transportation domain. Sorry.
Ganga was having another question here in the chat. If I just read this out, is there any chance that vicarious warm glow leads to free riding?
The intuition is that basically when you see more people doing the right thing, it gives you moral license to not do it as much, but still feel good that more people are doing it. So while it can inspire on the one hand, there might be cases where it could allow people to also feel exempt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think theoretically it's possible. I think our data would not support this hypothesis, because you would expect those people to be on the left side of the distribution, basically. But those people did not actually show a big increase in positive emotions after hearing the news. But I mean, this was the first study that we ran on that, and it's certainly, yeah, it's a very interesting hypothesis. It might be related to this complacency effect. Okay, if everybody else is doing it, so good, everybody's happy, and I don't have to do any more.
Mm-hmm. There are 2 more comments in the chat. One is by Emma. I'm just reading it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if the vicarious warm glow is more being driven by those who are already engaging in pro-environmental behaviors, giving the example that she's always happy when she sees her friends who eat meat, not ordering meat.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good question for the next study, actually. I mean, I cannot speak to it with the data we have, but it's possible. Yeah.
And another one by Daniel. Vicarious warm glow may also come from sort of goal gradient thinking, in the sense that if other act pro-environmentally, the effect on the environment will be greater.
Yeah.
Yes,
indeed, those are all very good hypotheses. I mean, we should dig a bit further into the foundations of this, because I think it can be a worthwhile tool, if you want to call it like that, to get more people acting. But definitely before the next intervention studies, we need to understand a bit better what the foundations are.
Okay. I think I don't see any further questions. Well, thank